Share a tattered Nikon 850 camera resting on the table beside him. It had been his lifeline to the outside world since he'd retreated here nearly 2 years ago, capturing the untamed beauty of this isolated patch of Montana near Glacier National Park. The walls of the cabin were adorned with photos of elk grazing and morning mist bald eagles soaring over Lake McDonald, and his now-covered ridge glinting in the weak winter. Sun to spit the comfort of the images, the cabin was eerily silent tonight, the kind of silence that pressed on his chest, reminding him of all that he'd lost. The sharp crack of ice, shifting outside, made him sit upright. He glanced toward the frosted window. Shadows plakes in the dim light, the towering VES shifting with the wind. Then he heard it, an unmistakable sound, a low guttural whimper almost like a dog's, but deeper. Elliot's pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone or anything this close to the cabin. The nearest road was 5-way, and most creatures avoid the warmth of human habitation during the cold months. She moved cautiously to the window, his breath fogging the glass as she peered into the snowy expanse. First, all he could see was white, the endless white of winter draped over it like a burial shroud, and the knit moved a large figured arc against the snow. Hunched low neath the porch, it was a bear, but not the robust majestic kind he had seen in summer lumbering confidently through the forest. This bear was gaunt, its fur clumped with steam, rose faintly from its nostrils as it panted heavily, its front paw pressed awkwardly into the snow. "No Jesus," Elliot muttered under his breath. His mind raced. This was a grizzly. Urusarctosaurable is a species both revered and feared in these parts. Normally such a creature would steer clear of humans, especially during hibernation season. But this bear looked desperate. Desperation could mean danger. He grabbed his flashlight from the kitchen counter, clicked it on, and opened the door. Just a crack, a gust. Obviously wind rushed in, biting his face. The bear barely flinched at the light, only shifting slightly to meet this gaze. Its eyes, amber pools of exhaustion, stared back at him with intensity he couldn't ignore. "Are you hurt?" Elliot whispered as if expecting an answer. The bear let out a low rumble, more a groan, and lifted its injured pain and limped a step closer, its massive frame zagging under its weight. Instinct told him to slam the door to lock himself away from this powerful predator. But something about the bear's movements, its labored breathing, stopped him. This wasn't aggression, it was a plea. All right, he muttered, more to himself than to the bear. Grabbing a thick wool blanket, they stepped cautiously onto the porch, boots crunching in the snow. Has stopped just short of the bear, who stood shivering in place. Up close, the animal's condition was even worse. Its coat was patchy, its ribs prominent beneath the fur. Frost clung to its whiskers like tinny icicles. "Let me see," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. The bear shifted its weight, lowering its head. Though resigned, it was then he noticed the deep gash on its paw, the skin raw and blackened around the edges. "Frostbite creeping in, you poor thing." His voice cracked as she wrapped the blanket around the bear's shoulders. It didn't resist, only flinched slightly as the warmth touched its easy fur. With one cautious step at a time, Elliot guided the bear inside the cabin. The heat from the woods to hit the bear immediately. It collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud, its breathing labored but steady. Elliot stood frozen, gripping the edge of the table for support. A bear grizzly was lying in his cabin mere feet away, and yet a surreal ace it was. She felt no fear, only an overwhelming wave of pity. Elliot retrieved a first aid kit from a cabinet, along with a jar of honey, real Montana clover honey he'd bought from a roadside stand months ago. He set the jar near the bear, unsure if it could eat in its condition. To his surprise, the bear's nose twitched, and with great effort, it licked at the honey, its tongue curling around the jar's rim. "That's it," Elliot murmured. "You be all right. We figure this out." As she sat down on the floor beside the bear, exhaustion hit him like a tidal wave. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind of exhaustion that had plagued him since the accident. It was the kind that came with purpose, the kind that made him feel if only for a moment to live again. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of the bear's labored breathing for the first time in a long while. Elliot didn't feel entirely alone. The morning broke slowly, a pale gray light creeping into the cabin through frost-rimmed windows. Outside, the storm had left a fresh blanket of snow, smooth and untouched, except for the jagged trail of paw prints leading to the porch inside. The warmth off the woods to have painted the walls with a faint golden glow. But it wasn't enough to shake the chill from Elliot's bones. She had spent the night in the leather chair, dozing lightly with one ear tuned to the sounds of his unexpected guest. The bear lay sprawled on the cabin floor, its sides rising and falling in uneven breaths. The blanket Elliot had draped over it was damp, now melted, now seeping into the coarse fibers. The creature stirred, its amber eyes flickering open, glassy with fatigue, but more alert than they had been the night before. Elliot approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching a safe distance away. "Looks like you made it through the night." The bear blinked its gaze following him as she reached for the first aid kit on the counter. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as she rummaged through the contents: antiseptic wipes, bandages, a small tube of antibiotic ointment. These were tools meant for human wounds, but they would have to suffice. "I'm going to help you," he murmured, more to calm himself than the bear. "Just don't bite me, okay?" The bear's injured paw rested awkwardly on the floor, the raw gash stark against the pale fur. Elliot knelt and placed the first aid kit beside him, taking a moment to steady his breathing. The air between them felt thick, charged with a fragile trust that could shatter with one wrong move. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against the paw. The bear flinched, a loud rumbling in its chest, but it didn't pull away easy. Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know it hurts, just hold still." He began cleaning the wound. Antiseptic wipe drawing a soft pain from the bear. Elliot winced in sympathy, his own heart aching as she worked. The gash was deeper than he'd realized, and frostbite had set in along the edge, turning the tissue black and brittle. He plied the ointment carefully, wrapping the paw in layers of gauze until it resembled a makeshift boot. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Not perfect, but it'll do for now." The bear lifted slightly, its size locking onto his with an intensity that made Elliot's chest tighten. It wasn't gratitude, at least not in the way humans expressed it, but there was something there, a flicker of understanding that left him momentarily breathless. Elliot rose and moved to the kitchen, where her mage threw the cabinets for something the bear could eat. They found a can of salmon, the label faded but still legible, and opened it with a manual can opener. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet cabin, drawing the bear's attention. He set the can on the floor a few feet away and stepped back, giving the animal space. The bear sniffed the air, at nose twitching, before dragging itself toward the food. It ate slowly, its movement sheavy with exhaustion, but deliberate as the bear ate. Elliot leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, the watched insolence, his mind a whirl of questions. Why had the bear come to him? How had it known he would help, and what had driven it to such desperation? In the first place, the storm had passed, but the forest beyond the cabin remained shrouded in an eerie quiet. It was the kind of stillness that pressed on his nerves, as thought the world itself was holding its breath. Elliot's gaze drifted to the window, where the snow-covered landscape stretched out in pristine isolation. He had chosen this life for its solitude, seeking refuge from the chaos of the world and the chaos in his own mind. But now, with this unexpected visitor laying wounded on his floor, he felt a strange sense of connection. It was as thought the bear's presence had shifted something within him, stirring emotions he had long buried after finishing the salmon. The bear rested its head on the floor, its breathing slowing into a steady rhythm. Elliot approached cautiously, retrieving the empty can and placing it in the sink. He couldn't help but smile faintly at the sight of the massive creature sprawled out like an overgrown doggy. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" He said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Guess that makes two." In a series of quiet moments, Elliot busied himself with small tasks, adding logs to the fire, sweeping the floor, and his own meager breakfast of oatmeal and instant coffee. All the while, he kept an eye on the bear, who remained mostly still, its energy conserved for healing. By midday, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting pale beams of light across the snow. Elliot ventured outside to check on his generator, the cold biting at his cheeks. As she trudged through the drifts, the world felt illy empty. The usual sounds off the forest bird song, the rustle of branches noticeably absent. When he turned to the cabin, the bear was awake, its head lifted as it stared at the door. Elliot paused, following its gazes. Something about the bear's posture seemed deliberate, intentional. "What is it?" it asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The bear turned its head toward him, briefly, then back to the door, its nose twitching as though catching a scent. Elliot quickening. "You trying to tell me something?" The bear huffed softly, a sound that was neither aggressive nor dismissive. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest as she moved closer, his mind racing possibilities. Whatever had brought the bear to his cabin, he was beginning to suspect, was far from over. The sun begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape inside the cabin. Elliot paced near the window, glancing at the bear. Its steady gaze remained fixed on the door, an unspoken urgency radiating from its massive frame. "What's out there?" Elliot murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. He rubbed his temples, his breath fogging into the cool air of the cabin. He had spent the better part of the afternoon trying to decipher the bear's behavior. But no matter how he analyzed it, they kept circling back to an undeniable truth. The bear was waiting for something or someone. The bear shifted, its massive paws scraping against the floor. As it tried to rise, Elliot instinctively moved closer, hand shaft raised as though he could steady the creature, but the bear ignored him, its focus unwavering. It took one unsteady step toward the door and paused, looking back at Elliot with an expression that could only be described as spleeting. "You want me to follow you, don't You, Elliot said softly. His voice wavered, a mix of curiosity and hesitation. The bear let out a low rumble, not threatening but insistent. It nudged its nose toward the door, then glanced back at Elliot. Again, the message was clear outside. The air was sharp and biting, the kind of cold that grated at exposed skin within seconds. Elliot pulled his heavy parka tight around him, the hood lined with faux fur brushing against his cheeks. His boots crunched over the thick layer of snow. As she followed the bear, its lumbering gait surprisingly steady despite its earlier weakness. The landscape stretched in every direction, an expanse of white broken only by the dark silhouettes of spruce and pine. The forest seemed to live in its stillness, the occasional groan of trees bending under the weight of snow punctuating the silence above them. The sky was a pale canvas strewn with hues of lavender and rose, the remnants of daylight fading fast. Elliot kept a cautious distance from the bear, his eyes darting between its injured Poe and the path ahead. Tracks in the snow told the story of their journey, a single set of deep paw prints now joined by the smaller, hesitant prints of his own boots. The bear paused suddenly, its ears twitching. Elliot stopped to his breath, hitching his strain to hear, but all he caught was the faint whistle of the wind. Through the trees, the bear tilted its head, listening to something Elliot couldn't discern before resuming its slow, deliberate march. "Where are you taking me?" Elliot muttered, though his words were lost in the icy air. They came to a narrow ridge, the trees thinning to reveal a steep drop into a shallow ravines, now had piled against the edges, creating precarious overhangs that threatened to collapse under the slightest weight. The bear stopped at the ridge's edge, lowering its head to sniff the ground. Elliot approached cautiously, his heart pounding easy. Now, he said, his voice is steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I'm right here." The bear turned its head to look at him, amber eyes glinting in the fading light. Then it let out a sound, half growl, half moan, and stepped forward onto the slope, its injured paw sinking deep into the snow. Elliot, these stated the slope was treacherous, the kind of terrain that could break bones if one misstep sent them tumbling, but the bear didn't seem to care. It forged ahead, its massive frame moving with a mix of determination and urgency. As Elliot followed, his boots slipped against the icy surface, forcing him to grab at low-hanging branches for support. The descent was slow and painstaking, each step a test of balance, and while the cold air stung his lungs and his fingers encased in thick gloves ached with the effort of gripping the rough bark. Finally, they reached the bottom of the ravine. The bear stopped its head, lifting to sniff the air again. It let out a low rumble and began walking toward a dark shape partially obscured by snow, a jagged outcrop of rock that jutted from the earth like the spine of some ancient beast. Elliot's eyes narrowed. The outcrop was more than just a geological anomaly. It was a cave, its entrance partially hidden by snow drifts and fallen branches. "You brought me here for this?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above whisper. The bear didn't respond, of course. Its actions spoke louder than words. It limped toward the cave, pausing at the entrance to glance back at him. The expression in its eyes was unmistakable, now pleading, desperate, almost human in its intensity. Elliot hesitated at the threshold. The cave's mouth yawned open before him, dark and uninviting. Humbled with his flashlight, the beams listening through the gloom. As she stepped inside, the air was colder here. The silence oppressed. His breath choked faintly against the stone walls. The bear followed him inside, its presence a comforting weight in the dark. It nudged past him, its movements purposeful despite its injury. Elliot watched as it approached a shadowed corner, where a small shivering shape lay huddled against the rock. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, but when they did, his breath caught in his throat. Two cubs, barely more than bundles of fur, were pressed against the cold stone. Their tinny bodies trembled with each shallow breath, their eyes half-lied with exhaustion. "Oh my God," Elliot whispered. He dropped to his knees, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "You have cubs?" The mother bear turned to him, her massive head lowering as if to acknowledge his words. Then she nudged one of the cubs gently, her nose brushing against its fragile body. Elliot swallowed hard, his throat tight. The had spent years capturing moments like this through the lens of his camera scenes of raw, untamed beauty that told stories without words. But his moment wasn't meant for a photograph. It was meant for action. Here, aged out cautiously, his gloved hand brushed against the fur of the nearest cubit. Was cold, far too cold. "They won't survive out here," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not like this." The mother bear rumbled softly, the sound vibrating through the stone. It wasn't a growl, but something deeper, a sound that seemed to resonate with trust. Elliot made his decision. He carefully lifted one of the cubs, cradling its fragile body against his chest. The other cub followed, its teeny paws claying weakly. "The Skodash's cooped it up. We're going back to the cabin," he said, glancing at the mother bear. "All of you." She stepped back into the fading light of the ravine. The cubs clutched protectively in his arms. The mother bear followed close behind. For the first time in years, Elliot felt something stir within him, a purpose he had thought lost in the depths of his own grief. The journey back to the cabin was slow and arduous. The snow deepening as the sun sank below the horizon. Elliot held the two cubs close to his chest, their fragile bodies trembling against the thick fabric of his parka. Each step took felt the heavier than the last, his boots sinking into the icy drifts that blanketed the forest floor behind him. The mother bear followed her, lumbering for a silent shadow in the twilight. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it habiting chill that seeped through even the warmest layers. Elliot adjusted his grip on the cubs, his arms aching but steady. "Hang on, little one," she murmured, his breath misting in the frosty air. "We're almost there." The cabin appeared like a beacon through the trees, its soft golden light spilling into the growing darkness. Relief surged through Elliot as they approached, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He reached the porch and carefully opened the door, the warm, thin side wrapping around him like an embrace. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, her massive frames the night. Elliot turned to her, his voice low and soothing. "Come on," he said, "it's safe." Here she stepped inside cautiously, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Her breath came in slow, visible puffs as she sniffed the air, her gaze darting around the small space. Elliot closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold and the storm that had begun to gather once more. Elliot laid the cubs in a folded blanket near the woods, to their tinny bodies curling instinctively toward the warmth. He knelt beside them, his hands moving with practiced care as she checked for injuries. One of the cubs whimpered a small plaintive sound that tugged at his chest. "They're so cold," Hem muttered, glancing toward the stove. Headed another log to the fire, the flames crackling and growing brighter. The mother bear settled a short distance away, her wary eyes fixed on her cubs. There was something in her gaze, an unspoken mix of trust and hope that made Elliot's throat tighten. He reached for an old quilt draped over the back of a chair and gently tucked it around the cubs. Their shivering began to subside, their breathing evening out as the warmth enveloped them there. "You go," Elliot said softly. "You're safe now." The mother bear let a low rumble, her head lowering to the floor. Elliot glanced at her, his heart aching at the sight of her exhaustion. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hours passed in a quiet rhythm, the cabin filled with the sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of the bears. Elliot moved between tending to the cubs and preparing a simple meal of canned soup and crackers for himself. He couldn't help but glance at the mother bear now and then, marveling at the unlikely companionship that had formed between them. When the cubs finally stirred, their teeny noses twitching as they caught the scent of food, Elliot felt a surge of relief. He opened another can of salmon, carefully placing it on a shallow dish. The mother bear nudged the dish toward her cubs, watching as they ate with slow, tentative bites. Elliot leaned against the counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin didn't feel empty. The presence of the bears, their quiet resilience, filled the space with a kind of life he hadn't realized he was missing. As night fell, Elliot sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting like the ember was rising from the flames. The events of the past day felt surreal, almost like a story he might have told himself on none of those lonely nights when the silence became too much to bear. Had glanced at the mother bear, who lay curled protectively around her. Cubs, her breathing was slow and steady, her eyes closed in what seemed like the first real rest she'd had in days. Elliot felt a pang of admiration for her strength, her determination to keep her family alive against all odds. "You remind me of someone," he's quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. His mind wandered to memories he had tried to bury of his wife CLA and their daughter Sophie. Claire had been the kind of person who faced every challenge with unshakable resolve, always finding a way to protect the people she loved. Elliot's chest tightened as she thought of Sophie's laughter, the way it used to fill every corner of their home. The cabin had never known that kind of joy, and for a long time he had convinced himself it never would. But now, as she watched the bear cubs snuggle closer to their mother, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The night deepened and the forest outside grew still, the storm quieting to Agent Lou whisper. Elliot sat in the chair by the fire, his camera resting on his lap. He hadn't taken a single photograph of the bears, despite their presence being the kind of moment most wildlife photographers dreamed of. It didn't feel right somehow to capture their vulnerability on film. Instead, he simply watched the mother bear steadied into a soft rhythm, her cubs nestled against their side. The firelight danced across their fur, painting the scene in hues of gold and amber. It was a picture he would carry in his mind forever, a reminder of the unexpected beauty that could emerge from the harshest of winters. As sleep began to claim him, Elliot whispered into the quiet words meant for noon. "But himself, you saved the man." May their saving Matooth cattled into stillness, the warm off the fire warding off the cold outside, and for the first time in years, Elliot closed his eyes with a sense of peace, knowing that in this fragile sanctuary they were safe. For now, the morning light filtered through the frosted window panes, casting faint streaks across the wooden floor. The cabin, usually still insolent at this hour, hummed softly with life. The cubs stirred under the quilt, their tinny paws twitching as they shifted closer to each other. The mother bear remained curled nearby, her breath rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Elliot sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. The steam spiraled upward, catching the pale light before vanishing. His hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. He glanced toward the bears, the sight of them filling the room with an energy he hadn't felt in years. The mother bear's fur had begun to dry her coat, shedding the crusts of ice that had clung to her. The night before, the cubs, though still frail, seemed stronger, their breathing more even, yet the harsh reality remained. This sanctuary waste emperor. Elliot rose from the table and moved toward the woods, adding another log to the fire. The flames leaped eagerly, casting the cabin in a warm glow. He crouched beside the stove, staring into the fire. As his thoughts churned, "I can't keep you here," he said quietly, the words directed more at himself than at the bears. "You need to go back out there, to where you belong." The idea of sending them back into the wilderness filled him with unease. He had spent years documenting the harshness of nature, its unyielding cycles of survival and loss. These bears had already faced so much. Could they endure more? The mother bear stirred, ears twitching. As if she had sensed his unease, she lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze that steadied him, excellent resilience and assurance that she had faced the wild before and could do so again. As the day unfolded, Elliot busied himself with preparations. She gathered supplies, dried fish, jerky, and an old toffa fashioned into a makeshift sled. The mother bear watched him intently, her head tilted slightly, as if she understood his intentions. The cubs, no more alert, explored the edges of the room with cautious steps. Elliot couldn't help but smile. A son of them, the smaller of the two, poured out a loose thread on the quilt. The other cub followed suit, its tiny growls of determination echoing faintly in the cabin. "Troublemakers," Elliot said with a chuckle. The sound of his own laughter surprised him, breaking the somber quiet that had settled in the cabin over the past 2 years. He crouched down and held out his hand, palm open. The smaller hesitated, taking a tentative step forward, its nose twitching as it sniffed his hand. Elliot's smile widened as the cub nudged him gently, its fur soft against this skin. "You've got some fight and you don't," you said softly. "Good. You're going to need it." By mid-afternoon, the sled was ready. Elliot had lined it with blankets, creating a space for the cubs' doorstep. During the journey, headied the tarp securely, testing the knots to ensure they would hold. The mother bear, sensing the shift in energy, moved closer, her injured paw dragging slightly against the floor. Elliot knelt beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "It's going to be a long walk," he said, meeting her gaze, "but I'll get you there, I promise." Her response was a rumble here, yes, steady and calm. Elliot felt a pang of admiration for her strength, the kind of strength that came from enduring hardships and refusing to give up. The first steps into wilderness were slow and deliberate. Elliot pulled the sled behind him, the cubs nestled inside, their tinny faces peeking out from the black blankets. The mother bear walked beside him, her gait uneven but determined. The snow, though deep, had hardened slightly under the sun's weak rays, making the trek a bit easier. The forest seemed different, now less forbidding than it had been the night before. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy. With snow, the air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. For the first time in a long while, Elliot felt a sense of purpose. With each step he took, they moved in near silence, the only sounds being the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. Elliot's thoughts wandered as they walked, memories surfacing unbidden. Had thought of Sophie, of the laughter that used to fill home. Had thought of the accident, the crushing weight of grief that had driven him to this his olated life. But now, walking beside the bear, she felt something shift. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a dramatic moment of clarity. It was quieter than that, as low realization that life, even in its harshest moments, still held moments of connection and hope. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they reached a clearing near a frozen stream. Elliot paused, his breath fogging in the cold air. The clearing was sheltered by a ring of trees, their branches forming a natural canopy that offered protection from the wind. "This might be a good spot," he said, glancing at the mother bear. She sniffed the air, hairs twitching as she surveyed the area, satisfied. She nudged the sled gently, her gaze lingering on her cubs. Elliot untied the sled and carefully lifted the cubs out, placing them on the soft snow. They stretched and sniffed their surroundings, their teeny paws leaving delicate imprints in the snow. The mother bear lowered herself beside them curling protectively around their small forms. Elliot stepped back, his chest tightening as she watched them. This was what they needed. A chance to grow, to reclaim their place in the wild. And yet the thought of leaving them here filled him with a strange sense of loss. "You're going to be he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You're strong, stronger than I'll ever be." The mother bear lifted her head, her eyes meeting his one last time. It was a look of understanding, of gratitude, and perhaps even a farewell. Elliot nodded, his throat tight. Asha turned to leave. The walk back to the cabin was solitary. The weight of the empty sled, a stark reminder of the life he had just left behind. But as she trudged through the snow, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had done what he could, given them a chance, and in doing so, he had found a part of himself. A thought that had lost the cabin came into view, its golden light flickering through the trees. Elliot stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeting him like an old friend. He sat by the stove, his camera in hand, and stared at the flames for the first time in years. He didn't feel entirely alone. The days that followed were marked by a stillness. Elliot couldn't quite place the cabin, felt emptier, quieter, the absence of the bears, leaving behind a strange echo in his routine. She would wake before dawn, make his coffee, and sit at the small wooden table by the windows, staring out at the snow-covered forest, the tracks they had left behind, the deep impressions of the mother bear's paws, and the tiny tentative prints of her cubs shed long since vanished under fresh snowfall. Elliot's mind often drifted to them. Were they safe? Had the cubs found their strength, the mother her resilience? He caught himself staring into the distance for too long, hoping to see a flicker of movement among the trees, though he knew they were unlikely to return. He's this coffee mug down with a quiet clink, the sound breaking the silence. The cabin was warm, the wood stove humming steadily in the corner, but he still felt a coldness deep within him. The memories of their time together lingered, those fragile, fleeting moments when the cabin had been alive with the soft trustful of the bears, the warmth of their presence filling spaces that had felt hollow for too long. That afternoon, Elliot ventured out, this neon camera's lung over his shoulder. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline landscape that sparkled under the weak winter sun. The forest was blanketed in pristines now, the trees dusted, with frost that glittered like shards of glass. He walked slowly, his boots crunching with each step, the air sharp and biting against his cheek. She hadn't taken the camera. Since the bears arrived, and holding it had felt strange, almost foreign. For years, photography had been his solace, the lens, a barrier between himself and the world. It allowed him to observe without engaging, to capture life without truly living it. But now the camera felt heavier, its purpose more uncertain. Elliot stopped near the frozen stream where he had left the bears. The clearing was quiet, untouched, except for the faint trace of his own earlier footprints. He stood there for a long moment, the camera hanging at his side. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the stillness pressing against them like a weight. He raised the camera slowly, the viewfinder framing the snow-laden trees and the stream glinting faintly in the sunlight. But as she prepared to press the shutter, his hand faltered. The image before him, though beautiful, felt incomplete. It lacked the life, the story that had filled this place just days ago. Elliot lowered the camera, letting it rest against his chest. A deep sigh escaped him, his breath visible in the easy air. He realized then that it wasn't the image he wanted to capture. It was the memory, the connection he had felt with the bears. They had become more than subjects for a photograph. They had become part of his story, a reminder of the fragile, fleeting bonds that could form even the harshest conditions. As she turned to leave, a sound stopped him. In his tracks, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the soft crunch of snow underfoot. This pulse quickened as she scanned the trees, his eyes searching for movement. For a moment, he thought they saw a shadow flicker among the pines, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared to someone. There he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response, only the gentle whisper of the wind through the trees. Elliot stood motionless, his breath catching in his throat. The sound had been real, he was certain of it. But whatever had caused it was now gone. The walk back to the cabin was slower, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of anticipation. Elliot couldn't explain it, but something about the forest felt different, as though it were holding a secret just out of reach. The thought lingered in his mind, tugging at the edges of his consciousness, when he turned to the cabin. The golden light of the woods greeted him, casting long shadows across the floor. He set the camera down on the table and sat in his chair, staring into the fire. The warmth his aching muscles, but his mind remained restless, replaying the sound he had heard by the stream that night. Elliot dreamed of the bears. The images were vivid and haunting, the mother bears standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes filled with the mixture of sadness and resolve, the cubs huddled close to her, their small bodies trembling against the cold. In the dreams, she turned to look at him, her gaze piercing through the darkness. There was a message in her eyes, something urgent and unspoken. But before he could understand, the scene faded, leaving him alone in the void. He woke with a start, this heart pounding in the stillness of the cabin. The fire had burned low, the faint embers casting a dim glow across the room. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, as he tried to shake off the remnants of the dream. But image of the mother bear linger, amber eyes etched into his mind. Elliot rose and added another log to the fire, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the wood. The dream had felt more than just a product of his imagination. It had felt like a call reminder that his connection to the bears wasn't over. Even if their paths had diverged as dawn broke, Elliot stood by the windows, staring out at the snow-covered forest. The horizon was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the kind of beauty that had once inspired him to pick up a camera, but this morning he didn't reach for his Nikon. Instead, he simply watched, letting the quiet fill the spaces within him. And as she stood, he made a promise not just to the bears, but to himself. He would honor their story, not through photographs, but through action. He would continue to care for this place, this fragile piece of wilderness that had given him so much, and perhaps in doing so he might find his own way back to the life he had left. Behind the echo of their footsteps might fade, but the memory of their time together would remain a quiet reminder of the bonds that could form in the most unexpected of moments. The days turned to weeks, the harsh winter loosening its grip on the valley. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of brown earth, and the skeletal remains of fallen leaves. The air, though still cold, carried the faint promise of spring, a subtle shift that whispered of renewal and change. Elliot's routine remained simple, splitting firewood, checking the generator, and preparing meals. Yet something inside him had shifted. The cabin on a fortress against the world now felt like part of a larger story, one that extended beyond